the mystery began in the late 60s when a couple of archaeologists started excavating the synagogue building at Capernaum, which is located north of the Sea of Galilee. And I think some of you might know that as the place where Jesus strolled around and taught at the synagogue, etc. And so they were excavating that building. And under the floor of the building, when they took out a couple of stones from the floor to look for datable pottery sherds, maybe underneath the floor, they found hundreds and even thousands of coins, all spread out over the surface. So every stone that they started to take out, there were more coins and more coins and more coins. Another mysterious object, or maybe a couple of objects, we found a stone block, a giant block, very heavy stone thing, and it was decorated with reliefs on all four sides and on top of it. So it's kind of like a low table. It has four little feet placed in the middle of the synagogue building, built into the floor of the synagogue hall. So the synagogue hall was plastered, but we have no idea what that table is, or if it's at all a table, or what it functioned for, or where was it meant to be. Point is that we don't have any reference to this story from Egyptian sources, and Egyptians wrote down everything. We have month-to-month calendars of what happened and how much rain there fell and who was in power and who was in charge of the treasury and whatever, and they don't mention this story at all.
Welcome back to the Gnostic Informant, and you are about to attain true gnosis. And I'm joined by Tana Rasala, and she has her PhD from UNC at Chapel Hill, and she wrote a dissertation on ancient coins. She's her specialization is the Hebrew Bible, all ancient Near East, and just a lot of you are here because that's what you're interested in as well. So it's great to have you on.
Thank you for having me tonight.
So your dissertation, I read a little bit of it, and it's really fascinating. I'm surprised more people.
You.
Yeah, it was really, it's mysterious. Like, you could tell us, like, so we got these ancient coins buried under these synagogues. Tell us about how they found them and what do you think they're doing there.
Right. So my dissertation focuses on ancient synagogues. And by that, I mean the buildings that were used as religious spaces by the ancient Jews in late antiquity. So late Roman, Byzantine period, mostly in Israel. We do have a couple of synagogues from the diaspora, but most of the synagogues that have been excavated from that time period are all located within Israel, Palestinian territories. So the mystery began in the late 60s when a couple of archaeologists started excavating the synagogue building at Capernaum, which is located north of the Sea of Galilee. And I think some of you might know that as the place where Jesus strolled around and taught at the synagogue, etc. And so they were excavating that building. And under the floor of the building, when they took out a couple of the stones from the floor to look for datable pottery sherds, maybe underneath the floor, they found hundreds and even thousands of coins, all spread out over the surface. So every stone that they started to take out, there were more coins and more coins and more coins. And at the end, they found 24,000 single coins dispersed over the whole surface of the synagogue. Inside the hall and also the courtyard that was next to it, the same thing, leveled the stones, more coins. Wow. And so, of course, they were baffled. They were like, what is this? Why would you put all of these coins under the floor? They were clearly not put together as someone was collecting coins and hid them there or has his own little treasury. No, they were scattered all over the whole surface. And so people were like, what is that? And so they thought maybe it's an anomaly with just Capernaum. Maybe that's a special case. But over the years, more and more synagogues were excavated, and we found the same phenomenon. In the 70s, synagogues were excavated in the Galilee, more coins under floors. Other places, more coins under the floor. And in the end, I think we have, well, I collected all of them. We had 14 different buildings where coins have been found scattered over the floor, under the floor.
Wow.
And so the mystery is that we don't know why that is. There are no written sources talking about this phenomenon. We have no indication why people would have done that from any other source but from what we found as archaeologists.
Wow. So that is fascinating because like when you think about coins in this magnitude, how many there are,
Mm.
you would think someone's tracking this. There's some sort of an accountant of like this is money, this is value. You don't just lose all this. So I'm wondering maybe if it was a quick like people knew about this and then something happened. Maybe the war broke out. Do you have any dating on these coins at all?
Yeah, so I looked at all the different coins, and so in the end, we have over 10,000 single coins from all of these different sites. And I tried to look at all of them if I could. Most of them are very hard to read. So we're not talking about the pretty gold coins or
Right.
even silver coins. Silver coins weren't really around at that time anymore. We're talking about the little bronze ones that are unfortunately heavily corroded when you find them now. So they're very hard to read. You can try to clean them, but I would say about 25 to 50% of the coins are just illegible. You can't read them anymore. But the ones that we can read date mostly from about the 3rd century CE to the 7th century CE. But it also depends according to which building. Some buildings have only coins from the 3rd century or 4th century, some buildings only from the 5th century, 6th century. But we do know that this phenomenon was around during those centuries.
And is there any coins that are like that? I know most of them are hard to read, but can you make out any of the images on them, or is there no images? Or what type of? Give us some examples.
So there are some of the smallest denominations that you can have at that time. So 1 cent, 5 cent, 10 cents. So the smallest denomination of bronze coins, and some of them have they're very standard. There's nothing exceptional about them. They're the Constantinian coins, the Justinian, all the coins that were around at that time are represented in those hoards, as you might call them. So there's nothing specifically pre-selected of like, oh, they're collecting weird coins, or there's nothing about the coins themselves that would indicate they have a special function within society. No, they're just your standard everyday little pocket change.
Oh, okay, that makes sense. Now, do you have any theories on how these got lost and just buried and forgotten about?
Yes, of course. So that's my dissertation. So I actually looked at coins from all different kind of contexts within synagogues, and I started making little groups depending on their function. And so the 14 buildings that we have with coins found underneath the floor is just one group. Another group that I made is coins that could have been treasuries, because we find them hidden, for example, in a pot somewhere, large quantity of them. So they had a different function than what we call the floor deposits. For floor deposits, there are just too many of them to be casually lost. You can imagine that someone is constructing this building, you have workmen building these floors and these walls and all of the furniture inside. If there would be 2,000 coins laying around, I think someone would have started picking them up. They're not worth a lot, but they're worth a little bit. You're not just gonna ignore thousands of coins laying around and just put your slab of stone on top of it.
Right.
So I do think we can say that they were placed there deliberately, and they were placed there to stay. They were meant to stay there under the floors forever. You can also say that they were placed there during construction, because it would have been way too much work and almost architecturally impossible to remove the floor and walls and have deconstruct the building to put the coins under there and then put it back up, especially as you mentioned, in a time of an emergency. We do have a couple of emergency hoards, but those are very easily recognizable because they're stashed together in a pouch or something and then put behind a bench somewhere where it's easily accessible. you have to think that these floor stones weigh thousands of kilos or pounds. You're not just gonna lift that to put your to put your coins under it. So clearly they were placed there during construction or renovation of the floor, and then the floor was put on top of it, and the benches and everything else, and then they just stayed there.
Um, that's fascinating. I couldn't help but to think about the passage in the New Testament where Jesus is talking to the Pharisees and saying that you've turned my father's house into a den of thieves and robbers, and they're talking about their
Oh,
money changers are in there. And I thought of this scene when I'm reading your dissertation, and the question I'm wondering now is what is the function of the synagogue in this time period, or even before that, like just different time periods? The function of the synagogue, how has it changed over time, and that type of stuff?
yeah. So we don't know when the phenomenon of synagogues started. According to some people, they might have started in Babylonia during the Babylonian exile, when people were removed from the temple and just couldn't go to Jerusalem. And so they needed to have a different space to
Oh,
gather in and to talk about God, etc.
makes sense.
We know of a couple of very old examples before Christ from Egypt. And so people think maybe they originated in diaspora because people didn't have easy access to Jerusalem and couldn't go to the actual temple. After the temple got destroyed in 70 CE, more synagogues do get built. And that is when we have the first synagogues in Israel itself. Like at Magdala is a very famous one. Synagogues from the first century now start to be built. Now, at this time, they were not as we would think of synagogues today, or like churches where you come and you pray and you have a service and you go home. They were much more communal social spaces. You could do anything in them. You could teach school or classes in them. You could have your birthday party in them. They're more like community halls that you could use for multiple purposes. And then, of course, you can also use them on Shabbat or other days to have your religious practices in there. But at the beginning, people were still very much hoping that the temple would get rebuilt, right? This was not meant to be a replacement of the temple. Especially still up into the 2nd century with the Bar Kokhba revolt, people thought, oh, the temple is going to get rebuilt, and we just had this communal hall in the meantime. But at some point, they realized, okay, this temple is not going to get rebuilt. And so the synagogue gets more and more functions of the temple mapped onto it. And so it's a process called imitatio templi, imitation of the temple. So they get more and more functions that the temple used to have. And so some people think that they had priests that would have services in there. And then you could bring your charity there and the other kind of things. And then especially because the Torah became so important, right? They didn't have an actual place to go to anymore, and they couldn't sacrifice anymore. So they lost that big ritual of sacrifice, which is so important to Judaism, to ancient Jews, and they couldn't do that anymore because you were only allowed to do that at the temple. So instead of a sacrificial cult, they were more and more focusing on the text, on the Torah. And that is when the Mishnah and then later the Talmuds got written in this late antiquity period. And so the synagogue then became the place where the Torah scrolls were kept. There would be a Torah shrine, and you could put your rolls in there, and you could have a side room for your rolls for the rest of the year and then switch them out. People could come and sit around and listen to the priest reading from the Torah. So over time, the synagogues got that sort of temple function, and then became the synagogues that we now know today as the sacred space, and they kind of lost their larger communal function over time.
Wow, that's fast. So it sort of splinters off from the one main spot to like a bunch of little spots, but they
Mm-hmm.
still sort of try to keep the purpose sort of in line of what you would do at a place of worship. Um, and so, do you think there's any evidence that there was like a lot of money being held in the temple period at the temple?
Yeah, at the temple there was, right. So people had to go to the temple to sacrifice. And so, of course, you could have taken your own goat with you all the way from Galilee to Jerusalem, but it's a lot more functional if you just take money with you and then buy your goats locally at the temple.
Right.
And so not only did you have a lot of merchants everywhere on top of the esplanade and on the streets around the Temple Mount, but you also had money changes because people would come from all different kind of places, and every region had its own currency. And so if you would come from Italy or you would come from Turkey, you had different coins with you, and you all had to exchange that at the money changers table for the local shekels or the local currency of that time, the silver coins. So there was a lot of economic activity going on in and around the temple, for sure.
Wow, that's really fascinating. I really enjoyed that, reading that. I want to get into some other. So you're into archaeology in other places as well. What are some places or discoveries that you've came across or know about, or someone else that maybe found, that people aren't as much as aware of as maybe people like in your circle? Like what some interesting stuff.
That is a good question. um, so another mysterious object, or maybe a couple of objects. So I've been involved in an excavation site called Horvat Kur. It's a small village up in the Galilee, also late Roman Byzantine period, also with a synagogue. And inside that building, we found a stone block, a giant block, very heavy stone thing. And it was decorated with reliefs on all four sides and on top of it. So it's kind of like a low table. It has 4 little feet, and it's decorated with geometrical motifs, and then also with some tableware, a pot, a jug, some candelabras, a ladle. And I was placed in the middle of the synagogue building. Now it's not in primary use; it's in secondary use. It was built into the floor of the synagogue hall. So the synagogue hall was plastered, and then the stone was plastered into it, so that the feet were no longer visible above the ground. So you could only see the upper part. But we have no idea what that table is,
Wow.
or if it's at all a table, or what it functioned for, or was it meant to be a part of the synagogue, or did it come from somewhere else? Was it taken out of a Roman villa and then placed there? There's nothing specifically Jewish about the table.
Wow.
However, at the site of Magdala, which I just talked about, 1st century CE, they found a similar table. And we don't know if there's a connection between the two or not, because the one from Magdala is 1st century, the one from Horvat Kur is probably 4th, 5th, 6th century, but you can't date a stone block, so we don't know how old it was when it was placed there. We think it was placed there between the 4th and 6th century, but it could have been centuries old by that point. We don't know that. But the one at Magdala looks very much the same, 4 feet decorated on all sides, but that one does have Jewish symbols on it.
Oh, no.
One side has like pillars, and people thought, okay, this is a view of the temple in Jerusalem that you can like look into, with then in the middle the ark or something more important that you'd want to show, and some oil lamps depicted on it. And so we have these 2 tables that maybe are the same phenomenon, maybe are 2 completely different functional tools for any kind of purpose within the synagogue building, but so far we have no idea.
It almost makes you wonder, because you're talking in the Galilee and Magdala, which Mary's from. It almost makes you wonder if there's maybe some Christian aspect to this.
That would be very early, though.
Oh, okay. So this is before that?
Yeah, I mean, 1st century Christianity wasn't really spread into the Galilee yet. So it took a long time for Christianity to spread, and specifically architecture or church architecture to spread. And that's actually one of the reasons why we also think that synagogues became more and more sacred spaces, because of the competition with Christianity, and because they saw that Christians had their own dedicated building that they would go to. Maybe Jews started seeing their own sacred space also a little bit as their local church that they would go to. And we do see some influence of church architecture on synagogue architecture. For example, we're starting to get the half round, what do you call it at the end, the apse, being built in 5th, 6th century synagogues. So it did have its influence. So we know that there was some competition or some borrowing of elements. But in the 1st century CE, that would be a little bit early.
And what kind of stone is it? Is there any? Do you know that or?
I think the one at Horvatkur is basalt stone, and the one at Magdala is limestone. Limestone is much easier to work, and so most of the decorative elements that you will find in synagogues are made in limestone. But Horvatkur is more to the north, closer to the Golan, and the Golan has mostly basalt stone, that sort of volcanic, hard gray rock. And most of the synagogues that were built in the Golan are made out of basalt. So that would make sense.
Wow. And how big is Magdala?
The synagogue or the town?
Yeah, the town.
The town is big.
Oh, it is.
Yeah, they have been excavating in the town for decades now. Different teams. There's a team from Israel and Italy, and then there's a team from Mexico, and they have all been excavating different parts of the town. The Italians have excavated a whole harbor complex, because the Sea of Galilee used to come a little bit more inwards, all the way against Magdala, and so you have the components of the harbor with the where you put the ropes around, all those kind of like those with the pier. Oh, yeah. And there might have been multiple synagogues in Magdala. Some people have thought that a second building that was recently found there could have also been a synagogue, and that might have meant maybe that different communities were making use of their own synagogue, maybe different because they had different opinions on how the synagogue should be run. But Magdala is now being turned into a tourist attraction. They build a large hotel there, they build a visitor center, they build a large church, trying to get the Christian crowd in. And so this is all going over ancient Magdala, so you're not going to be able to excavate there anymore. So we don't know where the borders or the edges of the town are. But it wasn't super small.
When it comes to the historicity of the Old Testament, where do you see, for example, this nation of Israel becoming an actual entity rather than what it says, compared to what it says in the text?
I think that most scholars would say after the Babylonian exile.
Interesting.
So before the Babylonian exile, of course, everyone lived in ancient Israel, and there were different tribes and different groups, and people a lot of people would probably worshipped Yahweh, but other people worship other gods, and we have a lot of evidence that they were worshiping a pillar figurine or using pillar figurines within their religion, etc., etc. So they were clearly not monotheistic, and so there was a lot of variety on the ground. Then with the Babylonian exile, the elite was transported into exile, and being away from the temple, they had to come up with other ways to preserve their religion and their identity. And I think that formed a kind of a bond between everyone that was in exile, having the same God and the same kind of main religion, sticking together abroad, and then coming back and seeing how the local population who had stayed behind had started worshiping other gods and was intermarrying and was getting much more diverse. I think that was the first time when they said, okay, we all have to be one and stick together and be one group. And then it's also kind of dominating their view of what they had developed abroad onto the local population, and kind of also grabbing the power in a way that's like, okay, only the temple in Jerusalem is legit, and only us priests or the people here know how to perform these sacrifices. And so you all have to come to us, and we know how to read these texts, and we know what's going on. And so they kind of made a cohesive whole with them at the top of this chain.
So before the Babylonian exile, do you think that the people living in the Levant were just sort of like city states, like they all had their own like thing going on? It wasn't really unified like the King David story tells us?
And still is. I think that any notion of there was once a great people where everyone thought the exact same thing and everyone believed the exact same thing is a fable that we tell
Yeah.
ourselves, right? There has never been one Christianity and there has never been one Judaism. And so people on the ground will always do what they think, there was a lot of magical practices. And we know from the Hebrew Bible, right? Every time that they say you're not allowed to do this, means that someone was doing that, right? And
Yeah.
so
Like the
don't go
abstract.
to necromancers, there were necromancers. Don't write tablets, there were tablets.
Yeah, so like for example, I think the best example of that is like don't have an Asherah pole. Like why would
Right,
you say I wouldn't imagine me if I just went to your house one day and said you shouldn't have an Asherah pole. What's an
right,
Asherah pole? Well,
right.
so clearly that must have been a popular thing. I mean, people probably like this goddess. Um, as an archaeologist, do you see a lot of archaeology that points to worship of Asherah, for example?
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, those Judean pillar figurines, right? I don't know if you have talked about it in a previous episode, but we have thousands and thousands of them. And yeah, we're not sure if they are a goddess that is being worshipped or if they're fertility figurines or are they being used as a stand-in for a family member that you're praying for or wanted to have blessed or whatever. Doesn't matter. The fact is they don't appear in the Hebrew Bible. They are not part of Orthodox Judaism, and still they are being used somehow in some sort of unknown practice. So that kind of shows that what is in the Hebrew Bible is the ideal, written down by people who were elites on top of society, who could write and who had their ideal form of religion in their head. But that doesn't mean that that is what's happening on the ground, right? We have a lot of local shrines, local altars being found in houses, in community buildings, all kind of ritual objects, found all over. So
Do you get a sense that there was a pantheon of gods at some point in time in ancient Israel?
I don't think a pantheon. We do have all these different names, right? We have Baal and we have Elohim. And so people have said maybe those were different gods coming from different areas, maybe from Arabia, we have a different name, and maybe from Egypt or whatever. But over time, they kind of all overlapped and they became more attributes of one god instead of different gods. We clearly don't have a pantheon as you would see in ancient Greco-Roman cultures, which each god having its own specialty or being responsible for a part of nature. That we don't have any evidence for. Could always be, but we don't have
Sure.
any evidence that that was the case. We don't have any mythological stories as you would have from the Hittites and other cultures around it, which talks about how the world was created out of these gods, or gods were having wars, or they have all these mythological stories about how human these gods are, and they fight with each other, and they get married, and they have children and offspring. We don't have anything like that from any texts that
Sure.
I know of from ancient Israel.
And brings me to the documentary hypothesis where they have these different sources, the Yahweh source, the Elohist source. Do you
Mm-hmm.
when you think about that, do you see any um re rembrandt of like a different maybe like different gods becoming one god? And can you see any examples in the text that kind of allude to that maybe?
Right. Well, just the fact that you call it the E source and the J source, right, means that in one text people were calling God Elohim, and in the other one were calling him Yahweh, and they were talking apparently about the same figure because you could mix and match the two texts together.
Yeah.
Um, so maybe that was just regional dialects. People had a different name for it. Um, we know from the Dead Sea Scrolls that still around the time of Jesus, there were all these different versions of these same stories and texts around. And it took a long time for there to be only one codified fixed canon. And so probably each village, each family, whatever, was telling the story in a different way and writing it down in a different way. And then over time, they all came together.
The Exodus, do you think there's anything historical to this at all, or do you think it's just completely myth?
I think there's some grain of historicity to it. It wouldn't surprise me if there was a group of people who escaped Egypt or have gone out of Egypt. If that is the ancient Israelites or another population, I don't know. But there does seem to be, because it comes back so often, right? And then it's so important for ancient Jewish identity and their culture that they all came out of that one place in Egypt, and then they found that promised land, and they had that journey to get there. It just seems so stressed in their narrative that I think there's a kernel of truth to it.
Right.
So people have said maybe it's a reference to the Hyksos coming back. I don't know if someone has talked about that before,
Yeah.
where around 1500 BCE, the people from the Hyksos who lived in Turkey, Anatolia, had been ruling Egypt, and then they were kicked out, or they left, and then they had to come through Israel to go back to Anatolia. And so maybe those people passing through had Jews among them, or ancient Israelites, or maybe they stayed. Some of them didn't go all the way back to Anatolia and stayed in ancient Israel, Palestine. So that could have been a remembrance of that event, or it could have also been, a group of slaves who actually did escape Egypt. The point is that we don't have any reference to this story from Egyptian sources, and Egyptians wrote down everything, right?
On the wall.
We have month-to-month calendars of what happened and how much rain there fell and who was in power and who was in charge of the treasury and whatever. And they don't mention this story at all, not even like later on, looking back on the past of like, oh, what a bad pharaoh that was, letting go of all of these people, or like the trauma that caused that, or any of those kind of things. So the story of 1 million people being enslaved, or hundreds of thousands of them, and then all going out of the country and then all settling in Israel seems a little bit exaggerated.
Yeah, when you couple that with there's no archaeology, that we don't have anything of like people being out there, and then also the fact that they're in the desert and they're starving and they're thirsty, but all of a sudden they're just going to go to war and fight a war and win this war. Like, who's funding the war? Who's paying? Who's buying the weapons? And who's feeding the soldiers? You're not just going to go to war all hungry and starving. So that seems a little bit far fetched. But when I read this, so I'm just I'm an amateur historian. Like, I like to read history, and I read Herodotus, for example, and I'm looking for what does he have to say about the Jews. Well, I'm flipping through the index. Nothing. He doesn't even mention Israel. It's like they're not even a place yet. And the reason why I bring that up is because when you look at the maps of the Egyptian Empire from the time of like Ramses getting a little bit after that, 18th dynasty, and a little bit beyond that, Canaan was just part of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
So this is my personal speculation. I want, maybe you can comment on this. Maybe the Exodus story is an allegory of remembering that they were once part of Egypt, Canaan being another just the north of Egypt, and the Red Sea being the divider between them getting their independence somehow.
Right. Yeah, I think people are still discussing it, and probably are going to be discussing it for 100 more years. The theory that I've mostly heard is that either there were ancient Israelites and they lived in the mountains, and the Canaanites lived down in the valley. And that is based on archaeology, pottery shapes, architectural layouts of houses. And then these people from the mountains came down and kind of took over or settled in between the people in the plains. And then we see the same pottery shapes over time appearing in the plains and the same architectural plans. So that could have been one part of it. Other people said maybe it was an internal uprising. The ancient Israelites were always there among the Canaanites, but maybe they were the suppressed or the enslaved people, or the lower class, if you can talk about different social classes at the time. And they had a revolution, and they kind of took over or rebelled or burned a couple of cities, and then got a little bit more of independence. Probably it's a combination of all of these things: people coming from the mountains, people coming from Egypt, internal people coming from Arabia, if you want to take into account those names of God that might have come from the Arabian Peninsula, all coming together at some point and forming this new culture identity. not cohesive yet, as we just talked about. You're still talking about a village here and there, a tribe, a little chiefdom, a little kingdom. So it's not that the ancient Israelites came there and, wow, I know, year one, all of Israel and Palestine was one culture and they're all dominating, right? It's a very long process of different factors and different groups coming together and slowly culture changing, right? And maybe there wasn't as much resistance by the Canaanites or other local people to take over certain parts of culture because they liked it too, or it was beneficial to them. And then slowly over time, society changed.
Okay, and the last thing I want to ask you before I get to Archeo Gaming is the historicity of the characters in the Old Testament. Do you think that a lot of them are real people? Do you think they're maybe so like mythology, like King David, for example, King Solomon, Abraham, Moses? Do you think any of these are real people, or all of them are not real people, or some?
Oh, it's so hard to tell. I mean,
Yeah,
speaking from an archaeological point of view, there's little you can say, right? You can
right.
find that the house of David was mentioned on that stele, right, on that inscription. So we know there was a David who had a house, and there's probably a family and a household. But in how far all the details of what happened to these people and these stories were accurate or happened, all to one person, or did they happen to 20 different people and then they got all mapped onto the same person? It's kind of like the King Arthur stories, right?
That's what I think.
Right? It's kind of a lot of stuff happens in society, and then you need a hero, and it's always the same hero. It's always Solomon who is wise, and it's always David who is brave.
Yeah,
Um, but who knows? Who knows? Maybe Solomon was a very wise king or chiefdom of a very tiny town that was then Jerusalem.
yeah, not like with 700 concubines and owning the richest man in the world. I think that's probably not. It's fair to say that didn't happen, but I think it's maybe possible that there was colonels.
Mm-hmm.
There was a guy named Solomon.
Yeah.
There was a guy. Maybe there was a guy named Abraham too.
Yeah.
We just don't have the evidence for it. But like, why make up a guy named Abraham if there wasn't a guy named Abraham? But I think I think a lot of the
Mm-hmm.
attributes that the text gives them probably was those theological truths in there.
Right, and so we have to remind ourselves that the people who wrote the Hebrew Bible text were not historians in the sense that we are historians, right? They didn't go out there and fact check and make sure that every detail that they mention is correct because someone is going to point out their mistake and they're not a real journalist anymore. That
Right.
was not the point of their stories. They're meant to convey a message. And they're meant to to instruct and to bring people together and to
Sure.
give a good example of what a righteous life is, and then they have wisdom lessons in them, etc., etc. That is the point of these texts, and the little details don't always matter.
Sure, I agree 100%. Archeo gaming is something that you talk about. First of all, what is that for anyone who has no idea what that is?
Archeo gaming is the intersection of video games and archaeology. Archaeology broadly conceived, history, ancient linguistics, all of that. So it's a broad term that was invented by a guy called Dr. Andrew Reinhardt, who wrote a book called Archeo Gaming, and which was the pioneering book on this field. And so Archeo Gaming is a broad concept that entails many different parts. And so one of the parts that Archeo Gaming does is we archaeologists, historians, look at video games, we play video games set in historical periods and assess if they're historically accurate or not. Basically, that's what we like to do, right? We like to play a video game, we like to point out, oh, that tool didn't exist yet, oh, those plots, they didn't have that yet in that year.
Awesome.
So we like to do that. But then we're also seeing more and more the advantage of video games, right? More people are getting their history classes, lessons through video games. It's a very popular media. It's replacing TV documentaries and books, etc. So for a lot of people, the only connection that they will ever have with ancient Greek, for example, is by playing a video game. And so we know the power of video games. And so we're trying to educate people on not to take everything as a fact. A lot of the stuff in video games is made up by the video game developers and by the producers. So don't take everything out of it. But they are very useful as tools. I remember being in undergrad and having to memorize the map of ancient Greek ancient Greece, where all the different cities are, and I'm like, oh, this is the Peloponnesus, and this is Sparta, and it took me forever to memorize all of these cities, right? And then I play Assassin's Creed, and I look at the map so often that I could just write it. You know, you memorize it so much better because you're having fun, and you want to look at the map 200 times to find a certain spot that you want to go to, and so they are so useful for teaching this sort of historical information in a very fun way. You're not even realizing that you're learning.
What is the most accurate game that you've ever played? That's like, this is so close. I know none of them are perfect, but if you had to pick the most accurate historical presentation of a game, what would you say?
Well, I'm not a medievalist.
Okay.
So, but I believe it would be Kingdom Come Deliverance.
Oh.
Even though, I'm not, like I said, I'm not in that. It's set in a fictional country of Eastern Europe. But I do know that the video game developers went out their way to make it as historical as possible. As in, there's no magic and there's no, dragons or anything.
Right.
Everything is realistic. You have to fight with a sword, and in the beginning it's difficult, and then you get better. But I was especially impressed by the churches and the monasteries, because say religion, just like how accurate everything was with the frescoes on the wall, and the monasteries had the gardens with the wooden fences and all of those like herb fields. I thought that was really well done. Yeah.
I personally have been playing Odyssey, Assassin's Creed lately, and it's got the whole map of Hellas from, what is it, the 3rd century BC, I think, something like that.
During the Peloponnesian Wars, so 5th century BC.
5th century, okay, yeah. And I was wondering if you've ever did your Archeo gaming on this game, what you thought about that.
Yes, so that's funny that you mention it, because I was teaching a class a couple of years ago, together with another professor, on magic and religion and antiquity. So anything magical and religious practices in ancient Rome, Greece, and a little bit of pagan surroundings. And so the class was already, we did different things. We read texts, and we had to, the students had to recreate magical objects from antiquity in our 3D makerspace on campus. And so they were 3D printing all these tablets. And so I thought it would be fun to also use the video game in the classroom.
Wow.
And so we actually integrated Assassin's Creed into the classroom and into the course, where we would read primary sources about a city or about a temple complex, and then we would play the game and look at the building now in real life in the game. And then we talked about, what surprised them. A lot of people would say, well, okay, I read that this building was that tall or that large, but I never realized how large it was until I, as an avatar, stood there and looked up and saw this giant building in front of me.
Wow.
And we can say an image says more than 1,000 words, right? You can describe a building or an object in 1,000 words, and you still don't really have a mental picture of it. And I find in that video game, you see it come to life, right? Not only does it have the building and the architecture, but it also has the flags and the tapestries and the flowers and the incense burning and all the sensory experiences that comes with visiting a sacred space that you wouldn't imagine if you just read about this old ruined building.
Yeah, and you can hear them speaking the language in the background. You can see the way they dress, the paintings on the wall, the way the ships look. Like, you think those are accurate? Those, what are they called? Triremes, or
yeah, the triremes and the different kinds of ships.
And I really was wondering what you thought about the way the Temple of Zeus. There's the big one. I can't remember which. I think it's Athens, maybe. Is it Athens?
Probably the one, on the Acropolis.
Yeah. What did you think about that part? Was that pretty accurate?
Yeah, I liked it a lot, especially when you do the discovery tour part of it, and you can walk around, and it kind of explains this was the beginning of the festival space, right? They would carry these draperies from this place to that place, then the bulls would be sacrificed here, and you could really see it come to life in front of your eyes. I thought it was really impressive. Yeah.
I remember playing Skyrim in 2011 when it came out, and I remember thinking, wow, This game is I've never seen anything like this before. And I remember thinking, I wonder what games are going to be like in like 10, 20 years from now.
I still think about that every
Yeah,
day.
and now I think about even beyond
Yes.
today, which is going to
Oh
be
yes.
it's going to be all VR. You're going to be able to live
Yes.
in ancient Greece. Like,
Yeah, I have a VR headset here, and I just can't wait to walk around in an Assassin's Creed kind of environment and even be more immersed into that world than looking at a screen.
because you literally are doing archaeology in a virtual world, and you're
Hmm.
someone who's educated with a PhD, and you can actually like critique this. Oh, that's accurate. That's not. And I'm sure I'm speculating here, but I'm sure I'm guessing that these gamers are paying attention to what you're saying and taking
Hmm.
notes and making sure the next time
Oh
around.
yes, especially Assassin's Creed. They have been so accommodating. So I reached out to Ubisoft when I was planning to use the game in the classroom, and they gave us, we talked to them, and they gave us free keys so that we could use the discovery tours with the students. They are really on top of using games as educational tools to teach history. They're very interested in this concept, and I can't wait either. I mean, I can see all kind of new jobs coming out for
Yeah.
archaeologists or historians where we're going to help create these 3D worlds or give guided tours to people in these worlds. Or, you go to a museum and not only do you see the object in front of you, you can immediately put
Go.
on the VR glasses and see how it was used and see it in a room. And
Wow.
oh, so exciting.
That is very exciting because you see in the gaming industry, you see one half, you see like the online buy this pack of cards and all that, like kind of like the money hungry side of the gaming industry.
Mm.
But this side of the gaming industry is really something to be proud of as like where we're going with it, because people are
Hmm.
getting educated, like you said, creating jobs, and it's just fun, you know.
Right, right. And so I'm also a part of a nonprofit called the Safe Ancient Studies Alliance, and we are trying to combat kind of decline of the study of the ancient world in schools in K-12 and in higher education. More and more departments of classics and archaeology, etc., are being closed, are being shut down because they're not economically profitable. Business schools are going up, and humanities departments are getting shut down. And so an argument that the boards often use is, well, no one is interested in these topics anymore, and why would you want to learn Latin? You need to learn coding. It's much more useful in this world. And then when you go to popular media, you see that people are still jumping onto anything that has anything to do with ancient Rome, are playing video games in the ancient world. So clearly there's still an interest
Right.
by people into this world, and they still want to learn more about it. And then you go to Reddit forums, and people are talking about all the mythology used in that
Yeah.
video game, and asking historians about the accuracy of this building or about this war or this battle. And so people are clearly still very interested in these topics. And so to still be educated in these ancient philosophers and these ancient historians, and who were they and why did they write certain way, etc., etc., I think is still very useful to a lot of people.
Absolutely. And that's what I try to do with this channel is I'm trying to bring people into like a dialogue from the experts to the masses and ask questions. And sometimes my Patreons will give me a question that I can ask later on for somebody. And yeah, I think I really do think that preserving history is important. Not like not to like redo it or try to like be like the ancients were, but like to remember this are the things we did wrong. These are the things that we did right, or maybe we should, stuff like that. It's a
Oh
study to
yes,
learn from it. You know what I mean?
people should listen to historians, and I'm not talking about myself, but like historians in general. People should listen to historians a lot more.
Yeah.
When I see certain tactics being proposed by politicians, for example, and I'm like, but they just tried that 20 years ago in that place, or like 200 years ago in that place, and that happened. And like, don't you know? And
Yeah.
not enough historians are being used as consultants, or are being read, or by the people who are making a lot of these choices, which is a shame.
Can you what? You don't have to answer this, but maybe you will. Can you give us a game that you thought was very inaccurate, or do you not want to be rude? Like,
Ooh, a game that was very inaccurate. I mean, I think there are two, or at least two different types of games, right? There are the ones that want to be historical, And then there are the ones who just use a historical setting because it's cool. And if Fortnite is visiting an ancient temple, that ancient temple is not going to look anything like an actual ancient temple, right? But that's also not the goal of the game. They want to give a certain atmosphere. So we always talk about authenticity versus accuracy. So something can be not accurate, right? It wasn't accurate that this building had 17 rooms and that they only had 2 statues, but it's authentic. It's what we expect of an ancient temple to look like. We wanted to have Doric pillars and a big statue in the middle, and then some sacrificial altars on the sides, and that just gives us an atmosphere of, oh, we're in ancient Rome. And so it's authentic, but it's not necessarily accurate, which doesn't really matter to me if that's not the goal of the game. That still means that people like to be in that kind of setting. They don't just want to be in a modern setting. They also want to go to ancient Rome or ancient Greek and be inspired by those cultures. So that's also purposeful.
Yeah, and I noticed that a lot of people, like Reddit, for example, they'll try to pick apart games like Skyrim, for example. You've got all these different provinces and different types of people. Like there's the Nords, and there's the I can't remember the other names. Oh, the Imperials. And they'll say the Imperials, those are the Romans, and the Nords, those are the people from Scandinavia. You're like, no, you're wrong. That's the Germans. And I think it's funny to have that conversation, but I think it's also, you should also remember it is just a game. They're not really basing it off. I mean, they might have been. Actually,
they're still getting inspired by a lot of traits of different cultures, right, to make their own fictional stories. Yeah,
that's exactly what I was getting at. In fact, Witcher 3, I think that this is my personal speculation. Please correct me if I'm wrong, or if you would think otherwise. But I think that what was the name? The Duchy of, what was it called? I can't remember darn, I forgot the name of it.
Yeah, I've also played it like 5 years ago.
Yeah, okay, I can't remember the name of it, but I think the one province was based off France, and then I think
there's definitely, because I'm Flemish, I'm Belgian Dutch, and there were a couple of Dutch names and street names and personal names in there. I'm like, oh, those are Dutch inspired. They're not really actual people that lived in the Netherlands. But.
Yeah, it was the map that was the DLC. I can't remember. I'll think of it later. But it reminded me of like southern France. There was like a lot of
with the vineyards.
Yes, that's the one.
That was beautiful.
Yeah, that was my favorite map in that game.
Yeah,
I think the other parts of the map were trying to look like Poland maybe, and then there was another one that was like Ukraine, I think, because it was like real mountainy and open with like the steppes and all that. But I thought that was fascinating how different maps had different feelings. Oh, that's the other one. The Skellige reminded me of Ireland. The way they talk, their accents, and like, it was very. So I just thought that it was really fascinating how they didn't try to base it off history, but they inspired the maps off parts of like Europe and stuff like that. So
I was just talking to some of my friends this week about how there's a big overlap between people studying archaeology and history, people playing video games, and people doing LARPing and like Dungeons and Dragons and stuff. Yeah. Like, well, it's because we're all interested in different cultures and like being in different worlds and like imagining ourselves being part of an ancient historic culture or fictional culture, or what would the architecture look like, and what the fashion, and what tools would they have, and we like to live in those worlds and have our imagination going.
Yeah, it's really fun. Is there anything else that you would like to maybe plug on? Any books coming out? Anything you want to point in direction toward?
Well, I'm looking for a job. No. I think I've said it all.
I'll put the link for the description for the dissertation, which is really really good read. People should definitely check it out. And like I always say, you have just attained true gnosis.
You have just attained true gnosis. The demiurge has no power over you.